Most people think the Wild West was ruled by revolvers. That lie kept the real weapons hidden. The frontier was controlled by tools so brutal and so effective that towns tried to erase them from history. They weren't displayed, they weren't celebrated, they were silenced. And the most dangerous ones were never meant to be remembered at all. When people picture the Old West, they see the same image again and again. A lone cowboy standing in the street, a six-shooter hanging low on his hip, dust drifting through the air, two men staring each other down while the town watches, from behind windows and porch rails. That image feels real because it's familiar. But familiarity is not truth. The real frontier was quieter, more tense, and far more dangerous than the movies ever show. Violence didn't usually announce itself. It didn't wait for witnesses. It didn't follow rules or rituals. More often than not, it happened suddenly, at arm's length, before anyone realized the fight had even begun. Because the most dangerous weapons of the Wild West weren't always guns, and the most effective ones were rarely worn where anyone could see them. They were hidden. They were improvised. They were silent. And they terrified the people trying to impose order on a violent, unstable world. Tonight, we're uncovering the Wild West weapons that crossed the line, weapons so feared that towns, sheriffs, and lawmakers tried to erase them from daily life. Not because they failed, but because they worked too well. And if you stay with me until the end, you'll see how one invisible weapon, not forged from steel, not loaded with powder, quietly reshaped frontier law and ended the West as we imagine it. The Wild West was not lawless in the way Hollywood suggests. It was unstable. Laws shifted from town to town, sometimes from one street to the next. A weapon that was perfectly legal on the open trail could land you in jail the moment you crossed into city limits. What mattered wasn't just what you carried, it was where you carried it. A revolver at a campsite was normal. A revolver in a saloon might get you fined. A revolver in the wrong town could get you disarmed, arrested, or worse. That instability shaped everything. Cowboys learned quickly that survival wasn't about bravado. It wasn't about looking dangerous. It was about control, about discretion, about having options when the obvious ones were taken away, so they adapted. They carried weapons that didn't look like weapons, tools that didn't require ammunition, implements that worked in silence, in darkness, and in close quarters, weapons meant for moments when a revolver was useless, illegal, or simply too slow. And those were the weapons that frightened people the most. One of the most feared weapons on the frontier wasn't a gun at all. It was the slungshot. At first glance, it looked harmless. A short leather strap with a weighted pouch at the end. Something that could be mistaken for a piece of tack, a repair tool, or a bit of riding gear. But inside that pouch was lead, stone, or whatever heavy material a man could get his hands on. Small enough to fit inside a coat pocket, easy to conceal in a sleeve, silent when used, and devastating. A single swing could fracture bone. Another could crush a skull. There was no warning shot, no smoke, no sharp crack to draw attention. In alleys, doorways, and crowded rooms, the slungshot was terrifyingly effective. That was exactly the problem. Lawmen hated slungshots because they left almost no evidence. A man could be found unconscious or dead with no gunshot wound, no blade mark, nothing obvious to point to the weapon. In towns trying desperately to present themselves as civilized, that kind of violence was unacceptable. By the late 1800s, slungshots were being banned across Western cities, not because they were crude or unsophisticated, but because they removed the spectacle of violence. They made attacks quiet. They made them personal. They made them unpredictable. A man didn't need training. He didn't need accuracy. He just needed proximity. And proximity was everywhere, in crowded saloons, in boarding houses, in narrow alleys behind gambling halls, in rooms where strangers slept only a few feet apart. The slingshot turned all of those spaces into potential killing grounds, and that terrified anyone trying to keep order. Another weapon that quietly vanished wasn't designed to kill, but it often did: the weighted sap. Originally intended as a restraint tool, frontier saps were modified beyond recognition. Heavier cores, thicker leather, extra weight added deliberately by men who understood exactly what they were doing. A strike to the head could knock a man unconscious instantly, or kill him just as easily. And because the weapon was short, flexible, and silent, it could be used in places where guns were forbidden or impractical. Saps were favored by gamblers, guards, stage drivers, and men who had learned the hard way that drawing a revolver in close quarters was a losing move. They could be hidden in sleeves, tucked into belts, or carried openly as something unremarkable. To the untrained eye, it was just another object. To the man holding it, it was absolute control. That terrified authorities, not because saps were new, but because they worked everywhere. Crowded rooms, narrow hallways, doorways where there was no room to step back or draw. When towns realized how often these weapons were being used to ambush men before they could react, bans followed. Quiet bans, local ordinances, confiscations that rarely made headlines. The goal wasn't to punish violence, it was to contain it. Knives tell a similar story, but not the kind most people like to hear. Hollywood loves Bowie knives, big blades, wide guards, dramatic silhouettes. They look impressive on screen, they look heroic, they fit the myth. But the knives that truly frightened people were smaller, thinner, and designed for one purpose: ending a fight before it began. Stiletto-style blades, push daggers, palm knives. These were not tools. They were not hunting implements. They were purpose-built weapons for moments when there was no space, no warning, and no margin for error. Push daggers were especially feared. Held in a closed fist with the blade protruding between the fingers, they required almost no skill to use. A simple forward motion was enough. That terrified people, because guns required intent. A man had to reach, draw, and aim. A blade required only closeness, and closeness was unavoidable on the frontier, in saloons where men stood shoulder to shoulder, in boarding houses with shared rooms, in stagecoaches packed tight with passengers and baggage. Many towns banned these knives outright, not because they were flashy, but because they made violence immediate. There was no escalation, no warning, no time to intervene. Some of the most brutal weapons of the Wild West were never manufactured at all. They were improvised: loaded canes, modified tools, weighted riding crops, blackjacks cobbled together from scraps of leather and saddle hardware. Everyday objects turned deadly by intent rather than design. These weapons left no paper trail, no maker's mark, no serial number, nothing for historians to catalog later, which made them perfect. A man could carry one openly without violating any ordinance. He could appear unarmed while being fully capable of violence. And when something happened, there was nothing to confiscate but an object that looked harmless on its own. Authorities hated that ambiguity. They couldn't regulate what they couldn't define. They couldn't ban what looked ordinary. They couldn't reassure citizens when danger looked invisible. So these weapons weren't recorded. They weren't celebrated. They weren't passed down in stories. They were quietly discouraged and slowly erased from public memory. Not because they were rare, but because they were common. And this is where the pattern becomes clear. The weapons that survived in history were the ones that looked dramatic. The ones that vanished were the ones that worked quietly. And as frontier towns grew, as populations increased, and as violence became harder to predict, the pressure to eliminate those quiet weapons intensified, because the real danger wasn't loud. It was unseen. And in the next part, we're going deeper into the weapons that pushed that fear to its breaking point. The firearms and close-range tools that forced towns to redraw the line between survival and control and changed frontier law forever. The quiet weapons frightened towns, but they didn't break them. What finally pushed frontier settlements into panic were the weapons that turned confined spaces into killing zones and made even armed men feel helpless. Because the West wasn't only wide-open plains and distant rifle shots, it was boarding houses. It was saloons packed shoulder to shoulder. It was stagecoaches rolling through narrow passes. It was cramped hotel rooms, dark hallways, and doorways barely wide enough for one man to stand. And certain weapons thrived there. The first was the shortened shotgun. Hollywood shows long-barreled scatterguns carried like props. But the versions that worried sheriffs were the ones you rarely see. Barrels cut down until the muzzle looked blunt and unfinished, stocks shortened for speed, guns altered to spread devastation at a few feet. In a saloon doorway, it didn't demand precision, it demanded presence. One pull could shred a table, punch through a wall, and ruin multiple lives before a second man even understood what happened. That was the problem. Towns had learned to tolerate gunfire. They could tolerate a fight that had shape to it. 2 men, 2 revolvers, witnesses who could at least claim to know who started it. But they could not tolerate a weapon that erased the illusion of control. A revolver might hit 1 man. A shotgun blast could hit many, and the damage was so immediate that the usual rules, draw, aim, fire, retreat, collapsed into chaos. So restrictions followed. Not always dramatic, not always written in bold letters. Sometimes they were practical requirements. Minimum barrel lengths, no shotguns in certain rooms, quiet confiscations at hotel desks, warnings from deputies at the edge of town. In some places, the message was simple. Keep that thing out of sight, or keep it outside city limits. Then came the cartridges. Movies make frontier ammunition look standardized and tame. Reality was rougher. Ammunition was expensive, sometimes scarce, and often inconsistent. Men reloaded when they could. They experimented when they had to. They overloaded powder charges, packed shot meant for predators into shells meant for defense, and built do-it-all loads that hit harder at close range than anyone wanted to admit. These were not always accidents. They were choices made by men who believed the next miles of trail might be the last, and that a clean, decisive advantage mattered more than etiquette. But those loads produced wounds that horrified even hard lawmen, tearing damage that doctors couldn't repair, injuries that looked excessive even by frontier standards. The result was predictable. Quiet pressure to standardize, to discourage certain loads, to confiscate what looked wrong, and to treat unconventional ammunition as suspicious. Again, the goal wasn't mercy, it was predictability. But firearms weren't the only problem. Close-range tools continued spreading, especially among men who moved through towns where guns were restricted, or where drawing a gun was likely to bring a crowd, a deputy, and a fast judgment. That's where small blades flourished. Push daggers, palm knives, thin stilettos, and compact knives designed to work when there was no room to swing. A palm knife could hide in a sleeve, a waistband, or a pocket that looked empty. It didn't announce itself. It didn't require distance. And that meant everyday encounters could become fatal in a blink. A shove became a puncture. A scuffle became a funeral. Worse, these knives didn't look like weapons until they were used. They looked like curiosities, tools, trinkets, anything but what they were. Lawmen couldn't reliably spot them. Quick searches missed them. And once again, the problem wasn't violence itself. It was invisibility. You couldn't deter what you couldn't see. And you couldn't reassure a nervous town when danger could be carried under a cuff. That fear spread into transportation. Stagecoaches were vulnerable by design. packed with passengers, narrow interiors, no room to maneuver, and no easy escape once a gun or blade appeared. A single hidden weapon could dominate the entire space. Robbers knew it, guards knew it, travelers knew it. And the more stage lines expanded, the more often communities heard stories of attacks that started not with a shouted threat, but with a quiet strike, an ambush in the dark, a sudden blow to the driver. A guard dropped before he could even lift his weapon. Those incidents pushed companies to demand change. Stage lines pressured sheriffs. Sheriffs pressured town councils. Town councils pressured lawmakers. And slowly, rules tightened. Not only about guns, but about anything that could be used too effectively in close quarters. This is where the frontier's relationship with weapons began to flip. Early on, a visible gun signaled trouble. Later, it was the opposite. The man who looked unarmed became the one people feared, because by then everyone understood the new truth. The most dangerous weapon wasn't the one you could see. It was the one you didn't know was there. Concealment itself became the enemy. Towns began enforcing carry laws more aggressively. Visitors were expected to check firearms at city limits or surrender them at the sheriff's office. Hotels and saloons posted rules. Deputies were told to watch hands, watch coats, watch the way a man moved. In practice, enforcement varied. Some towns were strict, some looked the other way, but the direction was clear. The West was trying to become predictable. But there was a problem that made the entire project almost impossible. Most of the weapons causing fear weren't carried in bags. They were carried on bodies, in sleeves, in boots, behind belts, under vests. A man could surrender a revolver at the edge of town and still carry steel. He could hand over a rifle and still carry a sap. He could walk past a sign that said, "No firearms," and still have something in his coat lining that could end a fight before it began. That forced another shift. Law enforcement stopped focusing only on objects and started focusing on behavior. Men who kept their hands hidden. Men who stood too close. Men who didn't remove their coats in a warm room. Men who watched exits more than they watched faces. Suspicion became a tool. And suspicion spreads like smoke, quietly, but everywhere. It changed the social fabric of the West. The frontier had once prized independence and self-reliance. Now it began to prize compliance and calm. Merchants wanted customers who felt safe. Families wanted streets that looked orderly. Investors wanted towns that seemed civilized on paper. The West was building a new identity, and certain weapons didn't fit the story. Every time a slungshot was found, the fear spiked. Every time a sap was confiscated, rumors followed. Every time a compact blade appeared where no one expected it, people felt the ground shift under them. Because it meant that laws alone weren't enough. Control required visibility, and these weapons were built to defeat visibility. So the most feared weapons weren't merely outlawed. They were pressured out of public life. Merchants refused service to men who carried certain gear. Hotels denied rooms to travelers who seemed armed in the wrong way. Sheriffs used vague ordinances with broad discretion because specificity only helped the weapons adapt. If you banned one object by name, someone built another that looked different, so the rules became broader and enforcement became more personal. That's when the West begins to look less like an open frontier and more like a place with borders inside it. And here's the part Hollywood never shows. The crackdown didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly, town by town, through hundreds of small decisions. A posted sign here, a confiscation there, a deputy who decided a man's pocket was too heavy, a judge who made an example, a hotel clerk who watched hands and insisted on checking coats. These tiny actions stacked up until the culture changed. There was another category that made towns uneasy because it looked respectable until it wasn't. The working tool carried as a weapon, a heavy wrench from a rail crew, a short length of chain, a pick handle cut down and smooth, a riding quirt weighted at the end. None of these things announced themselves the way a pistol did. You could walk into a place holding one, and no one could claim you were armed. Not in the clear way the law liked. But everyone knew what those objects could do at arm's length. And because so many of the feared weapons were easy to conceal, they created the worst possible problem. For a town trying to build trust, people started assuming others were armed even when they appeared unarmed. That assumption alone made tempers hotter. It made arguments shorter. It made men reach for insurance of their own. In other words, certain weapons didn't just cause violence. They caused fear. And fear changes behavior long before any shot is fired. A saloon wasn't a clean room with open floors. It was smoke, bodies, narrow lanes between tables, cards, elbows, and eyes that never stopped scanning. A boarding house hallway was a tight passage where two men could barely pass without brushing shoulders. A stagecoach was a wooden box with windows and no room to step away. In those spaces, the deadliest weapon wasn't the most powerful on paper. It was the one that worked instantly, silently, and without warning. That's why these weapons felt different. A gunfight, however ugly, had a shape people recognized. Noise, smoke, panic, witnesses, but a quiet strike to the head, a hidden blade, or a sudden blast at arm's length didn't feel like a fight. It felt like the rules were gone. And when people believe the rules are gone, they start demanding control from whoever claims to provide it. That's when towns stopped romanticizing the frontier and started managing it. They wanted streets that looked calm, rooms that felt safe, and visitors who followed rules. The hidden weapons threatened all of that because they turned every stranger into a question mark. And a question mark is the first step toward panic. And that sets up the final transformation. The last weapon to be erased, the one that wasn't steel, powder, or lead, but a practice so fundamental to frontier survival that eliminating it changed the West forever. By the time frontier towns truly understood the danger, the damage was already done. The weapons themselves were only part of the problem. Steel, powder, and lead had always been part of life on the frontier. What terrified people now wasn't what a man carried openly. It was the realization that violence no longer announced itself. It no longer followed familiar shapes. It didn't wait for raised voices, drawn guns, or a chance to back away. It arrived quietly. A man could sit at a table, appear unarmed, and still carry enough force to end a life in seconds. He could walk down a street with empty hands and still control a room the moment he chose to act. No sign on a wall, no ordinance posted at city limits could reliably stop that. This is where the final and most important weapon of the Wild West emerges. Not a blade, not a club, not a gun, but concealment itself. For most of the frontier era, concealment was a survival skill. Cowboys, gamblers, guards, and travelers learned to hide what mattered because showing it invited theft, arrest, or attack. A hidden weapon wasn't a declaration of violence. It was insurance. A last resort carried quietly against a dangerous and unpredictable world. But as towns grew, concealment stopped being seen as prudence and started being seen as intent. Because concealment meant uncertainty. And uncertainty was the one thing a growing society could not tolerate. A visible gun could be regulated. A visible knife could be banned. A visible threat could be negotiated with. A hidden one could not. Once towns accepted that the real danger came from what could not be seen, everything changed. Law enforcement stopped focusing on specific weapons and started focusing on behavior. How a man moved, where his hands rested, whether his coat stayed on too long in a warm room, whether his eyes tracked exits instead of faces. Suspicion became policy. This shift did not arrive through grand legislation or dramatic announcements. It spread quietly through habit and enforcement. Deputies began watching crowds more closely. Barkeeps refused service to men who would not comply with requests to remove coats or keep hands visible. Hotel clerks insisted on inspecting bags and checking firearms, even when the law was vague. The frontier was learning to police uncertainty, and that marked the beginning of the end. Because once concealment itself became suspect, the old survival logic stopped working. The very habits that had kept men alive on the trail became liabilities in town. A man who knew how to hide a weapon was no longer seen as cautious. He was seen as dangerous. That change rippled outward. Travelers altered how they dressed. Cowboys adjusted their routines when riding into town. Gamblers chose seats with more visibility and fewer shadows. Even honest men learned that blending in now meant compliance, not quiet preparedness. The culture hardened. At the same time, something else began to happen. Something less visible, but just as important. The weapons that no longer fit this new order began to disappear from memory. As slingshots, saps, hidden blades, and improvised close-range tools were discouraged, confiscated, or quietly punished, they stopped appearing in stories. The weapons that survived in popular memory were the ones that fit a cleaner narrative. Revolvers worn openly, rifles carried in plain sight, tools that looked honest, dramatic, and controllable. The quiet weapons were left behind, not because they were rare, not because they were ineffective, but because they were uncomfortable. A slingshot does not look brave. A sap does not look heroic. A hidden blade undermines the idea of a fair fight, so they were excluded. By the time dime novels, early histories, and later films began shaping the legend of the West, the erasure was already complete. Storytellers worked with what remained in public memory, not with what had actually governed daily survival. That is why the West, we remember, is loud. Gunshots echo. Spurs jingle. Men face each other openly in the street. The real West was quieter, more cautious, more suspicious, more focused on controlling what could not be seen. This is why the final weapon to be erased was not an object. It was a way of living. Concealment had once meant preparedness. Now it meant intent. And intent was something towns wanted to regulate. As the frontier closed, rules became formal. Jurisdictions expanded. Enforcement centralized. What had once been handled informally, through distance, reputation, and personal caution, was now managed through signs, authority, and compliance. No weapons in town. Check firearms at the sheriff's office. Visible cooperation required. These rules were not only about guns, they were about predictability. The West was trading independence for order, and once that trade was made, the hidden weapons lost their place. Not because men forgot how to carry them, but because being caught with them became too costly. On the trail, the danger was not having a hidden option. The men who adapted survived quietly. They learned new rules, new habits, and new limits. They checked weapons at city limits. They kept their hands visible. They accepted inspections they would have laughed at a decade earlier. The men who did not adapt became legends for the wrong reasons. They are remembered as outlaws, gunmen, and relics of a violent past. But what truly ended their way of life was not faster guns or better lawmen. It was the disappearance of concealment as an acceptable skill. The frontier did not end with a final gunfight. It ended with a slow tightening of control over the unseen. That is why so many of the most effective weapons of the Old West feel like ghosts today. They existed in margins, in coat linings, in sleeves, in boots, in habits that never made it into photographs. They were tools for a world where survival depended on preparation more than display. And once that world disappeared, the tools disappeared with it. The legends kept the guns, history kept the laws, but the quiet weapons were left behind. If you strip away the myth, what remains is not a romantic place, but a practical one. A world where men did not advertise danger. They avoided it. They planned for it. They carried solutions quietly and hoped never to use them. That is the real frontier logic, and it explains why the most feared weapons were not the loudest ones, but the ones that made violence sudden, silent, and impossible to predict. Those were the weapons that scared towns. Those were the weapons that changed laws. Those were the weapons that had to be erased, not because they were evil, but because they revealed something uncomfortable about human behavior. That when given the choice between visible danger and hidden danger, people will always fear what they cannot see. And fear, more than any weapon, is what ended the Wild West. If you want to understand the frontier as it truly was, not the polished version built for screens and stories, remember this: the most powerful force in the Old West was never the revolver. It was the quiet knowledge that anyone at any time might already be armed. And that truth reshaped everything. If you enjoyed uncovering the real history behind the myths, make sure to like this video and subscribe. There are more forgotten weapons, more erased practices, and more uncomfortable truths waiting just beneath the surface. Because the real West was never as loud as the stories make it sound. It was dangerous in ways most people never noticed. And once you see that, the legends never look the same again.